As Dan Lanning and the staff look to build out their first full recruiting class and beyond from 2023 and looking at 2024, what states do they need to dominate? What states do they need to have success in? We'll discuss with John Garcia of Sports Illustrated. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view if you're watching on YouTube every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks every weekday. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. If you're watching, you see I've got the man, the myth, the legend, John Garcia Jr., the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated, back again. John, welcome back.
Good to be back, sir. Appreciate the kind words.
Yes, indeed. So I'm thinking about recruiting pretty often hosting this show. And I know a lot of Oregon fans are thinking about that as well. And one thing that the previous staff did to help elevate Oregon's recruiting profile, and I think we saw this initially when Willie Taggart got there, is they started branching out into states that Oregon really hadn't had a lot of success with previously. We're suddenly getting kids from Florida, most notably, and that just wasn't something that happened a lot under previous coaches. So as you think big picture about Dan Lanning and the staff that he has assembled, what do you think for them to recruit at a high, let's say top 10 caliber level in a given year, in a given recruiting cycle? What states do you think they have to be able to attack and succeed in?
Yeah, well, obviously number one's California. That's kind of a given, right? You're in the Pac-12. You've paced the Pac-12 in recruiting over the last half decade, and a lot of that success has gone back to California. So that's kind of chalk, kind of expected. I'd say Arizona, which is becoming a more prevalent state really for everyone in recruiting because of the migration and football talent that is coming out of that state. I think that's another one to eye beyond the obvious. You're always going to plug into the Seattle Metro in the Pacific Northwest as well. That's just hyper local. And there's a couple kids a year in state that you'll jump in on. But I think with the last two coaching staffs, both Florida natives, of course, they recruited the state of Florida better. I don't think you have to focus on that state in particular if you're Dan Lanning. But that SEC kind of footprint does have to play a part in what Oregon wants to do on the recruiting trail. And this staff has maybe not the Florida riches in terms of its staff, but elsewhere in the South, there are a lot of ties. Dan Lanning, of course, coming from Georgia, speaks for itself. Carlos Lachlan is as famous, as comfortable, as well-loved a coach from an assistant perspective as there is in the South. And he's been kind of everywhere down there, most recently Florida State, Western Kentucky. And he just flexed that Southern muscle a couple weeks ago with the Dante Dowdle commitment out of Mississippi over Ole Miss, by the way. So those are the kind of SEC Bible Belt type of battles that I think Oregon is going to continue to contend with. And you have to contend for those kids in general. It doesn't have to just be in the state of Florida, but that does qualify as that SEC footprint. So you will see the Oregons remain active in the Sunshine State. Certainly this class is another example of that. Richard Young is probably the highest profile Floridian that the Ducks are still involved with. So I think that's a given. Everybody understands the talent coming out of those metros, Miami, Atlanta in particular. Those are maybe becoming the two best metros in recruiting. Atlanta has become maybe the best metro in recruiting, and South Florida has always been elite at talent production. And then I also think it's important to try to maintain consistency in Texas. We've hit all the big states, right? Florida, Georgia, California. You got to mention Texas in this conversation. Just one Texan signed in the last class. I think that number could grow or will grow in the class of 2023, but that's a state where just naturally you've got to stay aggressive because there's so much talent. And again, like we talked about with Arizona, a lot of moving parts in those major metro areas. Dallas and Houston, which are two of, I don't know, the 5 best in the country, a lot of transient folks in those areas. So there's multiple fan bases represented, multiple perceptions represented. So you have the ability, especially with no in-state school dominating, right? Texas A&M and Texas on the field, not quite there yet. There's an opportunity still for a lot of programs that recruit nationally to come in and make real headway in the Lone Star State. And we all recognize that Oregon brand and understand that it has the ability to dip into any pipeline, but maintaining the big pipelines in Texas and the Southeast, I think is going to be important to counter the West Coast and natural Pac-12 footprint that we have always expected and seen up in Eugene.
Yeah, I think when Lanning was hired, it definitely drew the attention of Oregon fans in terms of, what sorts of players we're going to get from those southern states, the Alabamas, the Mississippis, the Georgias of the world. But I was thinking a lot about Texas. I'm glad you touched on that because I wanted to ask you about it, because Texas is it's such a huge state and there's such a giant pool of players there. But there's also a giant pool of schools. And Oregon does have a coach who's coming from that state directly. Matt Powledge, our co-defensive coordinator and secondaries coach, he's coming over from Baylor, so he's probably got some ties down in that region. When you look at Texas and how many players are there and how many schools are there, do you feel like there's room for Oregon to come in and compete for big time guys? Because you've got a Texas A&M who's a recruiting power, like you said, on field, not quite matching what they've been able to do off the field yet, but Alabama goes into Texas. You have Texas, lest we forget, one of the biggest brands in the state, even if they're down. You've got Houston has been a viable program. Like, is there room for Oregon to kind of hop in and grab some good players each year?
I do think there's room because, as you said, in state, there's a billion schools, but none of them have taken a stranglehold on Texas. And I think A&M has the potential to do so, but their reach has begun to spread beyond Texas. And they are now recruiting more nationally with more effort in the Southeast and in the rest of that SEC footprint. So I do think that opens the door to a degree for schools to come into the state of Texas and compete like some that you mentioned. Alabama, LSU, Arkansas, those schools rely on Texas to a degree. So I think the Ducks can become one of those programs that is consistently trying to pluck out of there. It doesn't mean you have to get 6 or 7 a year, but if it's 1 or 2 a year consistently, and you can maintain a pipeline there. I look at a school. Let's go outside the SEC and the state of Texas and even the Big 12. Ohio State has gone into Texas very consistently and has pulled out some of their most notable players in the last decade, right? JT Barrett, J.K. Dobbins, Jeff Okudah was a first round pick of the Lions. Baron Browning just went into the NFL. They have dipped into Texas consistently, even though it's not at a high volume for the Buckeyes. Garrett Wilson, my goodness. So I do think that you can pick and prod a little bit in the state of Texas without being known as, hey, like Oklahoma, like, hey, we have to recruit 20 Texas kids every year. It doesn't have to be at such a high clip, but if it's a supplement to California and the Southeast and Seattle and those and Arizona, like we talked about, I think you can develop a bit of a pipeline, and I think Oregon could be in position to do that consistently because, again, that door feels open in Texas right now. The Longhorns are in transition. The Aggies are recruiting nationally at a high clip, but on the field, still question marks. Elsewhere, there's a lot of transition in and out of conferences, things like that. There's no dominant force that says, hey, when a Texas kid gets this offer, his recruitment is over. That doesn't exist at this point. And I think every school recognizes that door being blown wide open.
Well, we've been asking for updates from John on recruits, and we'll do that again. But we've also been asking for Built granola bars, and they are here. They come in 3 unbelievable flavors: chocolate peanut butter, chocolate coconut, and white chocolate berry, because they're covered, of course, in 100% real chocolate. If you want to try all 3 flavors, you can get a mix box at built.com right now. They're very different from Puffs, but they're equally as delicious. Go to built.com, use promo code LOCK15, get 15% off your order to get your Built granola bars. Now, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. So in the class of 2023, John, there are a number of names that Oregon fans are following, and we have here on the show. I want to start with Richard Young, who I find to be kind of one of the more interesting names the Ducks are still in the running for now that Dante Dowdell has committed, and he's a four-star recruit. So Richard Young's a big 5-star, right? He's got a lot of attention, a lot of big time schools going after him. What's his recruitment status, and where does Oregon stand in that mix?
Yeah, Oregon's right in the thick of it. Richard finally got up there for an unofficial visit up to Eugene and loved it. He loved the first impression of the Ducks enough to set an official visit up there. So that will obviously be paramount in terms of Oregon's staying power at the top of his list because it's a true national battle for Richard at the very top. You know, it's the Alabamas, it's the Georgias, it's the Ohio States that are high on his list. So the other schools in that mix have work to do naturally, right? Notre Dame is becoming a factor for him. You know, he just set that visit as well. But Oregon's been in that mix for some time. And again, he liked that first impression, something different, certainly outside the box. I mean, and he's looking for outside the box. It looks like he's set to leave the state of Florida. It's all but guaranteed that he's going to leave the state of Florida for college. So he wants something different. And then when you get into culture and geography and atmosphere and certainly temperature, Oregon offers a lot more different, I think, than a lot of these schools that are on his list. And he's, you know, he's a kid who's going to compete. You know, he's not one that if you have a running back committed, you're out of the mix for because he's looking over his shoulder. You know, he's going to go where he wants to go. So I was surprised to see some of the Texas schools, to take it back there, kind of slow in that race. They started to fizzle out a little bit, and it's become more of Georgia, Bama, OSU, Oregon, Notre Dame. And those are kind of the schools that have staying power here. And I didn't expect that five to be the five as we talked about this even a few weeks ago, much less a few months ago. So to me, returning to Eugene is a huge deal for Richard. He'll be able to bring more family members and spend more time intimately on campus without a spring game or anything that takes away from the coach's time with him. So I think he'll have a much better understanding of what that sell is up at Oregon. And I mentioned it earlier, Carlos Lachlan, you know, positionally is one of the more beloved, you know, recruiters really in the country. One of my colleagues ran into him on the trail. I've run into him on the trail, and it's been all positive. One of my colleagues was like, "Oh my gosh, I'll play for that guy right now." I mean, he's like, this guy's 50 years old. My colleague is, so he can't, but he would have if he were, you know, 28 years younger. And I think that's where, you know, you see Carlos Lachlan really helping Oregon to stay in the game for guys that otherwise probably weren't high on the Ducks, or at least willing to take a visit out to Eugene. So Richard Young will be, you know, maybe that next great case study after it went so well with Dante when he committed a couple weeks back.
We were talking about the state of Texas and the sorts of players Oregon can get. And I don't think you could ever have a situation like what Oregon has had in California in recent years, where it's, you know, a Cali flock movement, so to speak. And that's going to become much more difficult to attain now that Lincoln Riley's down there at USC, because that's now an attractive school once again. But I think if you can get a couple big time players like a David Hicks out of Texas each year, then this staff will be doing a good job. He's a big 5-star interior defensive lineman, a position that Oregon has added a lot of depth in this offseason, but also is going to have some departures after this year. This will be Dorles's last year. I'd have to look at Popo Almavai, but overall, it's a position that is critical to what Dan Lanning did with Georgia's defense. You think about a guy like Jordan Davis and David Hicks. I'm not going to say anybody's Jordan Davis, because I think Davis can make literally anybody look small, including but not limited to Fletcher Cox. I saw a picture of the two of them.
Yeah.
Fletcher looked like an average human being, and he most definitely is not. So what's the update on David Hicks? Because last time we talked about him, his recruitment was still really open. He hadn't narrowed much, but Oregon was certainly in the fold. Where's he at now?
Yeah, he's another who got up, I believe, for the spring game alongside Richard Young. So that first impression, again, enough to get a return visit. And I think, you know, in recruiting, we sometimes get lost in the logos, sometimes we get lost in the perception and the timeline, and it kind of muddies the water relative to the visits, right? Because we're just like, okay, he's taking this visit here, and you move on to the next school. But these return visits need to be more focused on, because they're coming in very short amounts of time. And in less than 2 months, he would have taken 2 visits to Eugene. If you said that 6 months ago to an Oregon Duck fan, they'd be excited. They'd think they were absolutely, you know, near the top of any kid's list. And I think that's the case here with Hicks. He's certainly, you know, the Dan Lanning angle in particular is massive here relative to that position. And then you think of, you know, a Tosh Lupoy on top of that, another, you know, guy who has been there and done that and now comes down from the NFL back to college, and it kind of flips that on its head. So not only is Lanning sending guys up to the NFL, now one of your position coaches is coming down from those ranks. And then before that, Lupoy was noted as one of the best individual recruiters in the country anyway. So he's knocked the rust off clearly, and has the Ducks involved with a lot of great prospects. He's more tied to the West Coast, but when he starts latching on to positional recruits, I do think it's a big deal for the Ducks going forward. And Hicks is buying into it. So he'll take that official, I believe, Miami or Michigan State, I should say, is getting another June trip out of him. And then, of course, you've got the in-state schools that are going to factor in Texas A&M. This is one Texan that they definitely want to keep within state lines. So that battle becomes a lot more classic in nature, right? Do you go with the hometown schools, or do you really push outside of that footprint? And at this point, you know, there's really no feel. There's no consistent buzz for any one program because he's a well-traveled kid and is taking his time with the process. So if he continues to do so and remains open, I think that just gives more time for the schools away from home naturally, right? If you're a Longhorn fan or an Aggie fan, you're like, I need David Hicks to commit ASAP, right? The sooner the better, because he's most familiar with those. But as he continues to take visits and extending that timeline, now all of a sudden you start to feel a little bit better if you're the schools outside of that Texas footprint. And again, Oregon, 2 visits in 2 months. I mean, that says a lot for a kid from any region, especially when you talk about Texans and Floridians like we have.
Just thinking about Hicks and the sort of player that he might be, I can see him fitting in at a number of places. Oregon principally among them, because you have Dan Lanning and a Tosh Lupoy, who himself was a defensive lineman, played at Cal back in, I think it was like 2008, 9, 10 ish, somewhere.
Ish.
Yes, yeah, ish. So somewhere around there in the first decade of the 2000s. But when you said Michigan State, I got to be honest, that also kind of stood out in my mind of like, boy, that seems like a Mel Tucker sort of player who also was once Georgia's defensive coordinator and is a big imposing. I mean, you watch that guy talk at the podium. He's got that presence about him. You're just like, oh, coach is talking. We're listening. So I think that I think there will be a number of teams that stay in the mix. Just thinking about the sort of player that he is. So not surprised to hear that. Another name that we've tracked from time to time and will do so again right now is Malik Benson, who's a big JUCO wide receiver. And, you know, I just get the sense that in football, you don't have as many JUCO players who pop into big time college players at the D1 level as you do in basketball. I feel like in college basketball, I don't know how much of it you watch, John, but kind of happens all the time. Oregon itself has had success with some phenomenal JUCO players, Chris Duarte, Chris Boucher, both of whom are now regular rotation players or starters in the NBA. But Benson has as much hype as any JUCO player that I can remember in the last few years on the recruiting trail, and he's got a bunch of big time offers, and Oregon is one of the teams that is after him. So where do the Ducks stand?
Well, the Ducks got the first official visit here in May, so they were the bar setter, the table setter for the visits for Benson, and they're really the outlier too, right? You know, it's all SEC schools and then Oregon. So it is quite the convention of recruiting for him outside of the Ducks, and the Ducks were the ones that got the first visit. I looked at many comments that he said about it. Surprised. He said it was lit, which is important for that age group. There's an excitement atmospherically for what Oregon could offer a kid like Malik Benson. And look, when you bring coaches from all over the map, like Oregon has, I was going to say Georgia, but I was thinking of Dan Lanning, like Dan Lanning has at Oregon, you have different levels of success with junior college recruiting, and it is a little bit more prevalent in SEC country. So bringing in coaches from that footprint, I do think helps with that sell. But also being a new coaching staff, I think is really interesting in this sell relative to some of the others, right? Because you can maybe offer more playing time. You can offer, hey, we are going to build something around you, relative to Alabama and Georgia on his list. Those schools aren't telling him they're going to build around him. They're telling him, hey, you can help us get back to the national title game, and we'll see what that role looks like down the line. And I think so that's one of those advantages of being a newer coaching staff that's trying to establish something. And I think offensively, when you think of Kenny Dillingham in particular, I do think that he offers some creativity. He's very much known for being innovative and a little bit outside the box. And when you watch Malik Benson, he's a guy that isn't conventional from a wide receiver perspective. He's not one that is super polished on the route tree that's really breaking down defensive backs at the top of his route. He's more of a raw talent that needs to be cultivated. And a lot of the ways they utilize him at Hutchinson Community College is catch and run. Hey, run this screen. Here's the rock, go make a play. And he can as well as anyone in the country. So I think with some of those dynamics, I think that, Oregon and Dillingham in particular can maybe, mold him in a certain way relative to some of the other programs that are a little bit more conventional, a little bit more pro style within their spread offenses. So I do think that's another selling point for Oregon. You always want the first official visit. To me, you want to set that table. So they got that box checked there as well. So I think, Oregon's going to stay right in the thick of this thing. I'm not sure on the timeline for Benson, but he's taken a bunch of officials in June to some of these other programs. So things could get accelerated here in relatively short order. But look, it'd be naive nationally to overlook what Oregon has done with pass catchers and wide receivers in general. I mean, there's maybe in the last 2-3 months, there's no program recruiting them better than Oregon, with bringing in Casper, flipping Cozart from Oklahoma a couple weeks ago. Things are really ramping up with that pass catcher group. Jerrion Dickey committed recently. That's all huge for Oregon. There's clear momentum there for Junior Adams, the position coach, and that staff. That it's really hot right now for Oregon. So it would be naive to sleep on them for a wide receiver, even with some of those, national title schools also pursuing him.
Last thing I want to ask you today is kind of a thought experiment, because you mentioned, the appeal that a coaching staff can have when they're new as opposed to when they're established. Would you rather be as a recruiter, say you don't have to be the head coach necessarily, but say you're on the staff, you're a defensive coordinator, you give off the vibe of a defensive guy. It's just kind of what I'm
Definitely
picking
a
up here.
defensive guy.
Yeah. So you're a defensive coordinator. Would you rather be a part of a staff that is just taking over the way that Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy and Kenny Dillingham are at Oregon? Or would you rather be a part of an established staff that has been having decent but not great results on the field over the last couple of years? Which do you think it's easier to recruit as from a coaching perspective?
I just think there's just so much natural energy at a new coaching staff and a young one like what Oregon has put together. So I would probably lean towards that new upstart program, especially if it's a brand nationally like Oregon's, or if it's in a great area of the country. I think I would probably like Florida's new staff. I'd probably want to be on board that train because you feel that new energy. You're new there too, so you're trying to prove yourself. There's just a different level of pace and a little bit more oomph with a program like that relative to like a Texas A&M, to bring it back to them, that is 8, 9 wins a year, consistent, stable, not flashy, not overly exciting otherwise. And you can kind of put those schools in a box to a degree. So I do think that that can hinder you, even if you are a great defensive coach like they have over there. And that's been the calling card of that roster, ironically, has been defensively over the years. And it hasn't changed that overall perception, even with an offensive head coach like Jimbo Fisher. So I think that's an interesting compare and contrast relative to Oregon or Florida or even LSU. I think I'd rather be on those staffs going forward, compared to a school, like A&M that has kind of been there and done that without being there and doing that at the highest level.
The man, the myth, the legend himself, John Garcia Jr., Director of Recruiting for Sports Illustrated, making his weekly appearance here on Locked On Ducks. Thanks, John.
Always a pleasure, boss.
Thanks for making this your first listen. Go make Locked On Pac-12 your second, where I'm hosting, talking about the Conference of Champions. I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.